Welcome back to another episode of FPO and G, Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. This week on the podcast, we're going to talk about Secure Act updates, right? So there was a big change to certain non-spouse beneficiaries. There are clarification given on what they have to do with RMDs in the 10-year rule. Justin, we're going to talk about how this is just evidence of how broken the tax code is. We'll talk about, hey, what does this mean for RMDs and future tax time bombs that we've talked about in prior episodes? And then we're also going to talk about, hey, what does this mean for the various different demographics we serve within oil and gas? But I think it's important to go back. And before we talk about any of that, we're talking about clarifying legislation on the Secure Act. When was the Secure Act passed?
Jared, the funny thing about this is the Secure Act actually predates our podcast. So When you asked that question, I remember doing content, Jared, it might predate us partnering together. I think I was writing like blogs alone about this 5 years ago.
Yeah, I joined in 2020 and the Secure Act was passed in 2019.
Unbelievable.
Also, table setting, it is 2024. So we are in an election year. So here's the thing, like the tax code is so broken because they're still trying to clarify what the legislation they even passed 5 years ago means. And we're in an election year. So by the time we're recording this in September of 2024, by the time this podcast gets out, like it might be stale. And by the end of the year, it might be completely thrown out for different tax legislation. So it's just so confusing. And even the clarification that we got earlier this year, only months ago, has more proposed legislation in it. So I just think that is so insane and just textbook evidence of just how broken the tax code is. And I mean, it's good job security for us because, we'll continually parse. Every time we get our arms around the rules seem to change, but it is just insane.
That's right.
So, Justin, I think a good spot before we talk about what these changes mean and why they're important for our niche. You just want to kind of like refresh and talk about why do we think the Secure Act and specifically non-spouse beneficiary RMDs were such the rules, like what they were and why that changed and like what that means. I know we had a podcast about it, but like we mentioned, a lot of time has passed since we last talked about it.
This is a big deal because if you have a large pre-tax retirement account, this is going to dictate how you're able to pass that account down to the next generation. Jared, you alluded to this prior to the Secure Act. A person could inherit their parents' IRA, and they could just take a required minimum distribution of a small fraction of the account. They could do that every year for the rest of their life. And so, quick example is, let's say that you inherit an account at, age 52. Well, in that scenario, you could simply take a small distribution from that inherited IRA every year for the rest of your life. So even if you're inheriting, a $4 million IRA, well, if you only have to take a small percentage of it every year, that's not going to be an overly big tax burden. But now, if you inherit an IRA and it was your parents' IRA, unless you fall into one of the very few exceptions, you have to take out that account over a 10-year period, which means that that's not a tiny fraction. That's a much bigger fraction of the account. And so that means that, hey, if you inherit this account and you already have some earned income and it's a big IRA, well, that IRA is going to be taxed at a really substantial marginal tax rate. What are we missing there, Jared?
No, yeah, that's exactly right. So the big thing is inheriting an IRA historically, even if you're a non-spouse, you get to take it over, RMDs over decades. And now if you're a non-spouse, most non-spouse beneficiaries, so we'll call a non-eligible designated beneficiary, you have to take the account in 10 years, right? Which really compresses the income, right? Because remember, distributions from an IRA are taxable. So I will call out just a couple nuances. Eligible designated beneficiaries, this does not apply. So if you're a surviving spouse, disabled person, if you're less than 10 years younger than the person you're inheriting the account from, like minor children, right? There are some exceptions, but for all intents and purposes, most of the people we see inheriting IRAs are not those, right? It's coming from a non-spouse. And so that's the demographic we're talking about. But Justin, you said, hey, non-spouse beneficiaries, you inherit the IRA, you have to take it over 10 years. But this is where the confusion lied when the legislation was introduced was, okay, does that mean I have to take an annual RMD? over the next 10 years and have the account depleted over 10 years? Or do I just have to have the account depleted over 10 years? And I know that sounds like a subtle nuance, but why does that matter?
Huge difference if there is a wide delta in your next 10 years of expected earned income. So if you are 52 and you're at the top of your career and you're in a top tax bracket, but you're expecting to retire at 58 and maybe by 59 or 61, maybe you have no income. Well, in that scenario, it would greatly benefit you to just not take any distribution from the IRA while you have that substantial income coming in each year. Once you retire, once you have no income, then take, the whole thing in the remaining years. And so it allowed you to really just do the simplest form of tax rate arbitrage. But Jared, I would also argue there's another huge problem here, and that is anytime you create complexity, you are inevitably, because it's kind of a game of numbers, there's millions of people with inherited IRAs, that some of them are going to mess up and forget their RMD. And Jared, skipping an RMD is one of the most punitive, one of the highest penalties in our tax code. So it kind of creates another layer of, hey, some people are going to forget to do this, and that's going to be a pretty big penalty bill on top of the tax bill.
That's exactly right. And so there's the decision tree is so wide. And of course, we talk about Michael Kitces, who's a thought leader in the financial planning profession, who has a team of tax planning nerds that kind of digest this. And we'll share a couple of good resources in the show notes. But hey, is the beneficiary eligible or not eligible? But then two, it's not enough to say, hey, I'm a non-spouse, I got to take it over 10 years. No, what the additional clarification of legislation that came out this year clarified is there's a delineation between people who inherited accounts where they were before RBD, which is the required beginning date, i.e. people who inherit the account before RMDs had started, and then people who inherit the accounts after RMDs had started. And so that's an important distinction. So if you inherit an account this year and the person you inherited from was not taking RMDs versus was taking RMDs, and the age in which they do that varies depending on when they die, because it's not confusing enough as is. That's an important distinction of, hey, if you're inheriting an IRA from a non-spouse beneficiary and you're non-eligible, had they been taking RMDs and had they not? So Justin, we got the clarification. So if the person had not started taking required distributions, then they only have to take the account. They still get what we thought, which is, hey, no annual distribution requirement. You just have to take the full account over 10 years. That's not really a change to what we thought. But if you're a non-spouse and you inherit the account and you had started RMDs, now you have two obligations. You have to take annual required distributions, and you have to take the account over 10 years.
Jared, I think that there's going to be more people that are tripping over this. And I think more people are going to take the small required distribution that they have to take, and they are going to mentally account or just think, well, I've checked that box for this year. And 8 years are going to go by, and they haven't taken out a meaningful chunk that will come close to depleting the whole account in 10 years. And I think the end result is there's going to be more people in years 8, 9, 10 that are still staring at a 7-figure inherited IRA, and they're going to have to take all of it out in 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, there's really kind of two dimensions to this, right? There's IRS compliance, and then 2.0 is really optimization, right? So I think that's exactly what you're getting at of I think the RMD can create additional confusion because you're thinking about, hey, I got to make sure I satisfy the RMD. If you're thinking about optimizing your lifetime income, okay, I know I need to take the RMD, but it could behoove you to take more. Of course, because it's a required distribution, you don't really have the option to take less. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just doing the RMD over 10 years will magically deplete the account. There still is some flexibility, and you may want to accelerate or decelerate the realization of income and the distributions of that depending on your income plan.
Absolutely.
I think it's good to kind of just talk through an example. So this is just lived experience, right? If you're one of two kids to inherit a $5 million IRA, so your portion would be $2.5 million. And the person you inherited the account from was not taking RMDs, you need to deplete the account in 10 years, right? So you could decide, hey, I'm retiring in 5 years. I'm going to take $0 from year 0 to 5, and then I'm going to take the full amount in years 6 through 10, right? Conversely, you inherit that same account, but the original account owner was taking required minimum distributions. You would need to take required distributions annually, and you would also need to deplete the account in 10 years. Still, you could incorporate some amount of tax planning into that where you say, hey, I'm going to take the minimum over the first year 0 through 5 because I'm still planning to retire in 5 years, and then accelerate the realization of income and the distributions from that account in year 6 through 10. But you're not going to get as much flexibility. But just because it's a required amount doesn't mean you need to take more than that. I would still think about, hey, where am I on my lifetime tax rate, and what's my tax rate going to look like is now versus 10 years from now.
And that's the tricky part, Jared. We did a podcast, Die with Zero, and it had some interesting data that basically showed that the average age that someone inherits assets is 58, 59. The reason I bring that up, so remember that when people are inheriting assets from their parents, it's typically, on average, it's happening at age 59. I mention that because if you meet with us, you've seen me do this on a whiteboard, but one of these central things, if you are in your 50s or 60s, one of the central things is we're going to get on a whiteboard and we are going to draw a timeline because from age 55 all the way to 72, 73, 74, there are critical dates that are dictated by the IRS. That govern when you're able to touch assets, what you can do with retirement accounts, when are you going to be dinged for Medicare charges, when do you have to, when can you take Social Security? And all of those really flow together. And so, Jared, I like to say that retirement timeline from age 55 to 70 plus, it dictates all of your financial planning opportunity in many ways. For a lot of this, you are inheriting assets right in the middle of your golden window for planning. So all of your tax plans are happening typically right when you are inheriting big assets. And so there's just a lot of moving parts there. And it's going to be a huge impact.
Justin, I think it's important because there's probably a segment of our client base or prospects or listeners that have inherited an IRA since this piece of legislation passed and thought they had 10 years and didn't have annual distributions and haven't been taken any up until this point.
Yep.
To that person, fear not. RMDs for you start beginning in year 2025. So if you inherited an IRA in 2021 after the Secure Act was passed and you plan on taking it over 10 years, but technically in light of this new legislation, you should have been taking annual RMDs, you're not going to get penalized or expected to, back pay those distributions. It's just on a go forward basis, you will have annual distribution requirements. So getting back to kind of, 1.0, which is compliance, make sure you have a good handle on this and kind of what your distribution plan is. A, so you're compliant, but B, also thinking about, hey, how does this impact my, lifetime tax rate, or even not even lifetime, but my tax rate over the next 5 years.
Absolutely. Jared, would it be helpful if we kind of talk through the implications of when this rears its head for the typical client we're working with?
Yes, because that's really like the meat and potatoes of this. It's like, okay, what does this mean for the demographics we serve? One additional housekeeping item is something that we think is interesting and kind of a fun little nuance. You're not going to make a profound difference, but it's nice to be aware of little things like this. We think financial planning is, hundreds of little things executed well over decades, right? So another thing that this legislation clarified is if an account owner was taking RMDs. So like, let's say going back to the example where you and a sibling inherit a $5 million account this year and there was no RMD taken, right? So let's say you inherit an account this year, that person was supposed to take an RMD and they did not. The RMD in the year of death does not have to be pro rata. So Justin, if you and I were brothers, we inherit the $5 million IRA. And let's say the RMD for that IRA for 2024 was $250,000, and you were the high income guy who doesn't need the money, and I need the money drastically. In the year of death, I could take a $250K RMD, and you wouldn't need to take any, right? So it doesn't actually have to be. It doesn't have to be pro rata. So and again, this is just a 1 year thing. But in the year of death, you kind of have a little bit of flexibility in terms of this is the aggregate that needs to be distributed from the account. especially with siblings, a lot of them have varying incomes, financial situations. Some might need it more or less. So that could be used to your advantage. And you might want to coordinate with your siblings if you have various different economic situations, and some may need it more than others. This is disproportionately beneficial if your income this year is exponentially higher than it's going to be next year. But it is something to be aware of, and a potential optimization opportunity if working with your siblings, especially if there's multiple beneficiaries involved.
That is so interesting. My word.
All right, Justin, let's kind of wrap it up with talking about, okay, so we know what the legislation is, how it's changed. What would you say this means for the primary demographics that we serve?
Should we kind of first give a quick overview of who are the demographics we serve?
Yeah, it's great.
Maybe we can split them into 3 groups. I think that's probably a good classification. So group number 1 is in their 50s or 60s or retired, approaching retirement. And they have, I would say, $4 to $8 million. Inevitably in that group, a lot of that balance sheet is pre-tax IRA dollars. A lot of that demographic is coming from, a larger oil and gas company. And so benefit structure, a lot of pre-tax retirement plans. So group number 1, 4 to 8 million, somewhere retirement is somewhere close. Group number 2, Jared, I'd say 20 million and above. I do think we probably should make 2 subcategories. One is there is, let's say 20 or close to 20 million up to 30 million. And then the other group is just way above 20 million. Different IRA planning consequences for those 2 subcategories. Group number 3 are younger families still in the accumulation phase. They're not retiring in the next 2 or 3 years, and they are on a path that will, get them to number 1 or number 2. And so those are the 3 categories. 4 to 8 million. So pre-tax IRA is central, 20 million or above, and then a younger person on the path to one of those. Now, Jared, the consequences for each, how about we start with number 1? Let's say you're 55 or 65 or anywhere close to that, and you've got $6 million, and 4.5 of that 6 million are in pre-tax IRA accounts. If that's your situation, and I mean, we do have a lot of folks in that situation, pre-tax IRA planning is massive. I would argue, and I'd be happy to debate anyone on this topic. If that is your balance sheet, you have 7 figures of future ramifications based on the planning decisions you make in the first 12 to 18 years of retirement. And that touches your charitable giving. It touches your retirement withdrawals. It touches how you manage each portfolio and each tax registration account that you have. It impacts family giving. It impacts Roth conversions, certainly. It impacts every part of your financial life. Your insurance policies are actually impacted in an indirect way as well. So, Jared, this is just a massive topic for that demographic. I think the other thing I'd say is it's kind of an interesting snapshot in history that, Social Security started with FDR. And kind of the outpouring of Social Security as companies started to have more of a pension benefit paid out as an annuity. But over time, annuities became less popular, and instead lump sum became a prominent option within pensions. And so the byproduct is you have 401k as a benefit. You have a really substantial company match in every oil and gas company, it seems. And then you're double dipping with pre-tax assets because your other major benefit is a pension. So we've written on this extensively, but that's why oil and gas financial planning is so unique, is just about every single company is putting in way more when it comes to a percentage of your paycheck into retirement plans than the average American. So, that's number 1. Anything you would add to that demographic, Jared?
No, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about, the young high income accumulators, but it's kind of a dying breed, right? That the ways people are being compensated today are very different than how the person retiring 10 years, 20 years from now is going to have a drastically different balance sheet. Like even if their savings rate is identical, just because of the way company compensation has transitioned. But we could talk more about that when we talk about young accumulators. I do want you to talk about, you kind of said 20 million plus, but I would say really, 10 million plus, and some people closer to over that and then way over. Like they are interesting because getting back to what you were talking about, even if you have a company with like a really aggressive match, especially in qualified plans, there's a cap to how much money you can put in there, right? And retirement plans they're not hundreds of years old. So even if you've been funding them as long as they've been in existence, unless you're doing a Peter Thiel Roth IRA, you're not going to compound that to tens of millions of dollars, right? There's a good chance the way you got to tens of millions in assets is, yeah, you saved, but also you had, probably some substantial liquidity events, after tax equity compensation as a highly performing executive, owning of a small business, something happening in the taxable bucket, in addition to kind of accumulating a qualified pool of assets. So yeah, you have pre-tax money, but as a percentage of your balance sheet, it's probably way less than the first demographic we talked about.
I'm glad you said that. And I'll get specific. It is very rare to reach more than 5 million in pre-tax IRA assets. And if a family is able to do that, if they have 6 or 7 or above, it's typically because there were 2 spouses in an oil and gas company. And so when we talk about our clients that have more in that 20 million range, well, Jared, those are mostly top 1% to 2% employees at a super major. They're making 7 figures in income every year. And a majority of their 20 to 25 million is in non-retirement brokerage assets, not pre-tax retirement assets.
Would you say this legislation is less important to that demographic because their balance sheet skews less pre-tax, or what should someone in this demographic be thinking about?
That's the crazy thing. So pre-tax, both tax planning and estate planning with pre-tax IRA accounts, it is so massively important that, Jared, I would still say that for the $20 million client who is potentially facing an estate tax, which is one of the most punitive taxes in our code, and right now it's a flat 40%, even for those families that will likely at some point pass an estate tax, if they have a $5 million IRA, that is potentially just as important. The stakes are potentially just as high. That's how much planning goes into it. Now, I mean, we have a few clients that are well above that range. And for them, it's, not as big of a deal as other items. But if you are coming from a major, and even if you have, 20 million plus, but a quarter of it is in IRA assets, I mean, that is definitely one of the top 2 or 3 things you need to be thinking about over your next 25 years. Huge 7-figure consequences there.
Yeah. And in that scenario, you might want to maybe accelerate some income to use some of your assets in your estate to pay the tax liability. Because if your kids are inheriting this asset, they're going to be paying it with money outside of the estate, right? So like it could make sense to kind of accelerate that and think about, okay, who's inheriting this? What's the potential tax liability? How does my estate look? So Justin, let's wrap up with young accumulators, because I think this is an interesting thing where their employment situation, their economic benefits package is very different. How should they, does this impact them? How should they be thinking about that?
2 points there. Young accumulators could be on the beneficiary side of this. And so estate planning kind of has, the original person's planning, and then it has planning around the inheritor. So if they are inheriting a 7-figure IRA, I mean, we absolutely need to dial in how we should game plan this 10-year rule for them. Now, on the flip side, most of the planning we do is for that oil and gas retiree that has a, really big IRA. And how do we think about this for their children? Now, on that front, Jared, for accumulators, this might be a hot take. I think Roth accounts are arguably too popular among our age group. So say mid 30s up to mid 40s or so. And I guess what I'm trying to say there is, if you are 55 to 65, you spent your oil and gas career in a time period where basically every major was offering a big 401k match, maybe a profit share in that 401k, and a pension. Well, the next wave, the next generation, I mean, there's a huge difference. The pensions are going away and equity compensation is replacing it. And so if that's your experience, I just made a big speech about how giant IRAs are critically important and have 7-figure tax consequences over a long period of time. And even if you have $25 million, a $5 million IRA is one of the 2 or 3 most important things you need to plan around. So it's that important. But I guess, my take here, Jared, is if you're 40, most of your benefits and compensation, it's so much more tax diversified than the 58-year-old today. I'll caveat that. I mean, if you're 42 at ExxonMobil, you still probably have the ExxonMobil pension plan and the ExxonMobil savings plan. So maybe even if you're making $500,000 a year, maybe you should consider some Roth contributions. But in large part, if you're younger and you're in a higher tax bracket, you need to be doing pre-tax. And this kind of pre-tax tax time bomb that we talk about, it's not going to affect nearly as many 39-year-olds as it does 59-year-olds.
Yeah, because considering like when you factor in a pension and qualified retirement plans, you were contributing, you and your employer, $100,000 of dollars plus. And now those days are gone. So mathematically, you can't get to the big pre-tax time bomb, but you do need to think about, hey, what assets am I inheriting? If you're high income and your siblings might not be high income, you might want to trade in terms of what assets you're inheriting. Right. But again, it's also, hey, I want to build tax diversification. You're right. Like Roth has definitely had its day in the sun, but we'll see people converting assets to Roth and you're in the highest marginal tax bracket. It's like, we're excited about Roth, but we're also not in a rush. You're in the peak earning years in the highest tax bracket. So, I wouldn't get so fixated on the tax savings as, hey, let's build some tax diversification. And then, you have time, you have decades and decades to optimize your tax situation. So it's more important than you're saving than versus just, hey, I need to build Roth assets today. Justin, anything else before we wrap up?
I think that's perfect. If you've got, let's say, 2 million in an IRA, all the way up to, let's say, 5 or 6 million. And just like Jared said, even if you have $2 billion, you're probably not going to have an IRA that's a whole lot bigger than 5 or 6 million. The math limits just don't really allow for that to happen. I think the big takeaway is anyone in that range, the consequences long-term are huge. You need to do extensive planning and you got to be ahead of it. This isn't something you can put off 20 years and then plan for it. You have to plan for it little by little each year.
And RMDs are a minimum, right? Doesn't necessarily mean they're optimal. So Justin, I look forward to recording this podcast again in 6 months when we have additional clarification or new legislation. But until then, send us ideas for future topics or the format podcast@brownleewealthmanagement.com. Thanks. We'll see you next time.